Let's look at the details of some of the stories inside the papers. Joining me to do that is political commentator Portia Berry-Kilby. Portia, very good morning.
Good morning, Rosie. Thanks for having me on.
What do you make of this strategy then from Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman to say, if you come here, we'll deport you and detain you?
Well, I think first and foremost, there's the question of whether it will actually hold up against law, though Rishi Sunak has said that his plans are legally watertight. Then it also raises the question of effectiveness. And let's face it, a lot of policies haven't been effective. So maybe this is the tipping point. And at the end of the day, it does seem fair that you disincentivize illegal crossings, not only for those immigrants who do come here through legal means, but also for the safety of those crossing the channel. There has to be a disincentive there, because at the moment you do have hundreds and thousands of people risking their lives to come from France to the UK, and that in and of itself isn't a positive thing and should be stopped for their own safety.
I guess the Rwanda plan hasn't proved a deterrent so far, though, has it?
No, it hasn't. And I guess this is another kind of step in that direction of saying, okay, if you do make it here, there is no chance that you come back, and that you skip your chances, and that safe and legal routes are the way forward. So it does show a little more innovation on Rishi Sunak's part. But at the end of the day, provided there are people operating the illegal crossings from France, there's always going to be some people coming across, and there has to be more of a clampdown on the French side and by the French against those who are operating these illegal crossings.
Do you think this plan's really going to work? Because if it gets all snarled up in the courts, there'll be no sort of repercussions for the people who arrive in the meantime.
Well, exactly. And it does kind of offer that window. And as the weather gets warmer, you might always see a surge in people trying to cross now, whilst they can, and whilst they know that there is that kind of grace period before this potentially comes into effect. But at the end of the day, Rishi has to do something, so the Braverman has to do something in their roles to try and stop this. And the idea of a lifetime ban is, I think, a fair deterrent. You know, people want to have a safe place to come to. And if they know that they're throwing away their chances of being resettled in the UK for life or forever getting citizenship here, then that seems a fair disincentive. And obviously nothing's ever going to be perfect, but it at least is consistent with signalling that, you know, safe and legal routes are open and should be pursued. And that's only fair on everyone.
Let's look at the latest dispatch of WhatsApp messages from The Telegraph, and two real sort of stories for us to get into. First of all, it's this idea that Matt Hancock rejected plans to reduce the quarantine period from 2 weeks to sort of 5 days of tests. We'll look at that in a moment, but also this scrutiny, I guess, on Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, facing calls from many senior ministers to resign after it looked as though some of his messages were quite critical. But before we do that, Portia, let's just listen to the words of Alan Evans, former senior civil servant, now political historian, who's sort of specialised in the history of the Number 10 private office. He was on Times Radio last night discussing how WhatsApp's used as a mechanism within Parliament.
One of the things we have now in government, and not surprisingly, is the speed of decision-making is much faster. In the past, you'd get written submissions and then you'd get telephone calls, then emails. Now, a lot of decision-making is made by WhatsApp groups, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. And indeed, it might be quite good in a crisis to be able to get a quick message out to a number of people and then feed it back. But you know, in terms of the language used, I'm a bit careful about judging it just by what we've seen in the papers, because they may just try and put the most juicy bits in, and you don't see the full story, which is what the COVID inquiry at the moment is trying to find out and establish the facts.
Portia, are we just getting the juicy bits?
Well, I think there's always going to be some of that. And to be fair, there is a specially curated leak that's going on, and we're getting only some of the messages. And the COVID inquiry will take into consideration the whole setting and context. But at the same time, the juicy bits are still legit messages between and an exchange. And I think some of what has been revealed in these messages is quite damning. But at the same time, who isn't kind of perfect when it comes to their WhatsApp record and have a squeaky clean set of exchanges. So I think it's somewhat up in the air. Is this actually damning enough for Simon Case? He was very much critical of some senior ministers and indeed the Prime Minister at the time. But it is a WhatsApp message, and you'd expect that those things are private. So it's very much, I think, the COVID inquiry needs to come fairly quickly and clarify actually what has been going on.
Well, Simon Case, in particular, said he described Sunak's opposition to COVID restrictions on businesses as bonkers and said it was hilarious that holidaymakers were going into hotel quarantine on their return to the UK. Not that hilarious if you're one of the people who followed the rules.
Not at all. And I think, if anything, these messages show just how many decisions were taken kind of on a whim, and that you have the people
Does it
making
suggest
decisions.
they're on a whim? Because we've just sort of established the fact that we don't have the full story. We've just got a little bit of a snapshot of maybe the juicy bits.
I think that's fair, but I think it is a snapshot, and there needs to be contextualization. But I think there's also exchanges going on which show, okay, there are certain senior ranking people revealing what others have said, especially, say, the news this morning that broke on the times of isolation, and Chris Whitty sending messages to Matt Hancock saying the modelers have said that 5 days could work, the modelers have said that 3 days could work. And Matt Hancock replying saying, oh, this seems too much or too short of a time. And Chris Whitty saying, okay, grand, I'll go back to the modelers and see what they say. I think that raises serious questions. And of course, there is extra context around this, and who knows what messages were sent just before or just after.
Yeah, we're talking about that time period of our lives that we called the ping-demic, where you'd get a message, and if you'd been in contact with someone, in some cases that meant 2 weeks of not having any contact with anybody. Of course, for some people that had a real impact on their livelihoods because they couldn't go to work and couldn't get paid those days. So I'm sure there'll be many more stories to come from the lockdown messages from the Telegraph. I wonder how many days they can let this run for. In the Times, Portia, we would have been talking about ambulance workers going on strike today, but the strikes were called off for talks this week. Does this suggest we had sort of a different set of talks with nurses in the last few days, and now with ambulance workers, that we could be seeing the beginnings of the end of strike action?
Very hopefully so. And I guess this is finally some good news that there aren't going to be strikes today and Wednesday, and the hope of a pay rise for these workers, and the expectation that there will be an offer on the table regarding that. In response to them having below inflation increases for last year. So hopefully this will reach some conclusion, though at the same time there are still scheduled strikes coming up for junior doctors, with a 72-hour walkout possible. So it's not fully through and into the clear for NHS strikes. There is still more for the Prime Minister to navigate, but this does show that there's some compromise being reached.
Yeah, there had been a bit of a stalemate with the 3 unions that were going on strike. GMB and Unison had suspended their own strike programmes on Friday, and then Unite called off their strikes over the weekend. They'd had some new reassurance from the government. If I flick to the other page of the Times, page 3, the Toblerone icon, the famous logo, its photograph is in much of the papers. It's going to have to go through a bit of a rebrand, isn't it? Why?
That's correct. So the Toblerone company has moved some of its production to Slovakia, and because it's a milk-based product and Switzerland has laws that stipulate that all milk-based products made, if it's using the landmark of Switzerland, it has to be made solely in the country. This means that Toblerone will no longer be able to use the famous mountain. And so we'll have to reinvent its packaging. And this will see, I guess, 50 years of that famous peak on the packaging removed due to moving some of its production to Slovakia.
I know the rule is you've got to have sort of 80% of your product based in the country to use images of the country on your packaging. So if Toblerone move its base, well, there we go. There goes the famous Matterhorn on the packaging too. Thank you so much, Portia, for going through the papers with me this morning.